The intruder. I used to live in a small town in North Texas, a place so close to the Oklahoma border that it felt like the edge of the world. The town was a patchwork of old, crumbling neighborhoods and forgotten streets, the kind of place where the past clung to the present like a stubborn stain. When I was 20, I lived in one of those neighborhoods, in an apartment complex that had seen better days. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the air always carried the faint scent of mildew. It wasn't much, but it was all my girlfriend and I could afford at the time. The area had a reputation: break-ins, thefts, the occasional police siren cutting through the night like a warning. But I wasn't too worried. I'd lived in worse places before, like Oak Cliff in downtown Dallas, where the shadows seemed to move on their own. One night, I was off work, sprawled on the living room floor with a copy of Shogun in my hands. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I'd been reading for hours, lost in the story, when I realized I needed to use the bathroom. I set the book down and got up, stretching my legs as I walked toward the back of the apartment. The place wasn't big, just 2 rooms and a bathroom, connected by a narrow hallway. As I reached the hallway, something caught my eye. Muddy shoe prints on the floor, fresh and unmistakable. They were facing the living room, right where I'd been lying just moments ago. My heart skipped a beat. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. The apartment was small, but suddenly it felt like a labyrinth, every corner hiding a threat. I followed the footprints, my pulse pounding in my ears. They led down the hallway to my bedroom, a cramped space with a bed, a dresser, and a single window near the top of the wall. The prints started at the window, crossed the bed, and then looped back to the same spot. The window was slightly open, the latch loose, as if someone had forced it. My bedspread had faint smudges of mud where they must have stepped. The sight sent a chill down my spine. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. The only way in or out of the apartment was the front door in the living room, where I'd been lying just minutes before. But the window, how had they gotten in? And how had they left without me seeing them? The blanket I'd pinned over the window to block the light was still in place, perfectly undisturbed, as if no one had touched it. But I knew better. Someone had been here. They'd climbed through the window, moved the blanket aside, and stepped into the room. They'd walked through the apartment, down the hallway, all the way to the living room, where I'd been lying on the floor, completely unaware. The thought of them standing there, watching me, sent a wave of nausea through me. I spent the next hour searching the apartment, checking every corner, every closet, under the bed. But there was no one, just those muddy footprints, that open window, and the lingering sense that I wasn't alone. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, felt like a threat. My girlfriend tried to understand, but she hadn't been there. She didn't feel the same unease that clung to me like a second skin. Eventually, she suggested we move, and we did. But it took me years to shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even when I was alone. To this day, I still wonder who it was, what they wanted, and how they managed to slip in and out without a trace. The knocking. This happened about 6 months ago. I was in my room, getting ready for bed. It was late, maybe 10:30 p.m., and the house was quiet. My curtains were closed, blocking out the night so I couldn't see outside. I was putting things away when I heard it. 3 loud knocks on my window. The sound was sharp, deliberate, like someone was standing right outside, demanding my attention. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Then instinct kicked in, and I bolted out of the room, running straight to my dad. I live with my parents and 2 brothers in a busy neighborhood, so hearing noises isn't unusual. But this was different. The knocks were too precise, too intentional. My bedroom faces the backyard, not the street, so for someone to knock on my window, they would have had to walk all the way around the house. My dad checked the backyard, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe an animal or my imagination playing tricks on me. But the next night, it happened again. 3 knocks, just like before, at almost the exact same time. My dad checked again, but there was no one. No footprints, no sign of anyone being there. The knocking kept happening, not every night, but often enough that I couldn't relax. I started sleeping in my parents' room, too scared to stay in my own. Eventually, my parents let me move to a different room, hoping it would help. For a few nights, it did. But then the knocking returned. This time, I looked out the window and saw someone crouching outside. A figure in a gray hoodie and dark jeans. I couldn't see their face, but they were there, real and undeniable. My parents called the police, but they didn't find anything. We installed cameras, but the knocking stopped after that. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but the memory of those knocks still haunts me. The basement light. We've lived in this house for 7 years, and from the beginning, I felt like we're not alone here. The first time it happened, I was in the basement, looking for a tackle box with fishing hooks. The basement is partly underground, with windows that let in just enough light during the day. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I didn't need to. I found the hooks and set them on a table near the closet. As I was putting the tackle box back, I bumped the hook box, and it fell to the floor, scattering everywhere. I bent down to pick them up, and that's when it happened. The basement light turned on. At first, I thought it was my husband. He usually got home around that time, and I figured he'd come downstairs to help me. I even said, "Thanks," but there was no reply. I called his name, but he wasn't there. I was alone except for my dog. The light had never turned on by itself before, and it hasn't since. The switch was flipped up, so something or someone must have moved it. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of anyone being there. I still don't know what caused it, but it was the first of many strange things that have happened in this house. The landlord. When I was 16, my family lived in an old, rundown house far from town. We rented it from a man who lived a couple of miles away. He seemed normal enough, but I always stayed inside when he came around. One day, I was home alone, playing The Sims 2 in my room. My window faced the driveway, so I could see anyone coming from a mile away. When I saw a car approaching, I knew it wasn't my dad. Panic set in. I closed the blinds, turned off the lights, and locked the doors. It was our landlord. He walked around the house, trying to peek through the windows and open the doors. I hid under the table, clutching a baseball bat, my heart pounding. Then he started calling my name, his voice light and playful, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Eleanor, I know you're in there," he said. "Why don't you come outside? I brought something special just for you." I stayed hidden until he left, but I'll never forget the sound of his voice or the way he seemed to know I was alone. The man in the woods. When I was 13, my friends and I were hanging out at the park by the woods. We were walking down a quiet path when we heard a noise behind us. We turned around and saw an older man, maybe in his 60s, wearing dirty clothes and standing with his dog. He stared at us, his eyes locked on ours, and started walking toward us. We ran, splitting up at a fork in the path, but when we met up again, we saw him still following us. We ran back to the playground, too scared to go back into the woods. Even now, more than 10 years later, I still wonder what he wanted and why he was so determined to follow us. Each of these stories carries the weight of the unknown, the lingering fear of what might be lurking just out of sight. They're not just about the events themselves, but about the way those events change you, leaving you forever looking over your shoulder, wondering if the shadows are just shadows or something more. 1. The Whispering Walls. Premise: a young woman, recently divorced, moves into an old, secluded farmhouse to start over. At first, the solitude is comforting, but soon she begins to hear faint whispers emanating from the walls. The voices are indistinct at first, but over time, they grow clearer, revealing secrets about the house's dark past and her own life. The whispers start to mimic the voices of people she knows, luring her into a false sense of security before turning sinister. She discovers that the house was once owned by a cult that believed in trapping souls within its walls, and now they want her to join them forever. Stephen King-esque twist. The protagonist realizes too late that the whispers have been manipulating her actions all along, and the final scene reveals her trapped within the walls, her voice now joining the chorus. 2. The Shadow in the Mirror. Premise: A teenage boy is left alone for the weekend while his parents are away. Bored and restless, he begins to notice something strange about the antique mirror in the hallway. At first, it's subtle, a shadow that lingers too long, a reflection that moves when he doesn't. But soon, the shadow begins to take on a life of its own, mimicking his movements with a slight delay, as if learning from him. One night, he wakes up to find the shadow has stepped out of the mirror and is standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with hollow eyes. The shadow begins to replace him, piece by piece, in the real world, while he is pulled into the mirror's cold, dark void. Stephen King-esque twist. The story ends with the boy's parents returning home, calling his name, and the shadow, now fully in control of his life, answering them with a perfect imitation of his voice. 3. The clock that counts down. Premise. A reclusive elderly man lives alone in a creaky, old house filled with antique furniture. One day, he discovers a strange, ornate clock in the attic that he doesn't remember owning. When he winds it up, the clock begins to tick. But instead of telling time, it counts down. At first, he dismisses it as a malfunction, but soon he notices that every time the clock ticks, something in the house changes. Furniture moves, doors creak open, and faint footsteps echo in the empty halls. As the countdown nears 0, the man begins to see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his vision, waiting for the clock to stop. He realizes the clock is counting down to his death, or worse, the release of something that has been trapped in the house for decades. Stephen King-esque twist. In the final moments, the man smashes the clock to stop the countdown, only to discover that it was the only thing keeping the entities at bay. The story ends with the sound of the front door creaking open as something steps inside. Each of these ideas taps into the fear of isolation, the uncanny, and the slow unraveling of reality, hallmarks of Stephen King's style. Let me know if you'd like me to expand on any of these. Story: The shadow in the mirror. The mirror had always been there, hanging in the hallway of the old Victorian house. It was an ornate thing, with a gilded frame and a surface that seemed to ripple like water when you looked at it too long. For 16-year-old Jake, it was just another piece of his parents' obsession with antiques. He barely noticed it, until the night his parents left for their weekend getaway. The first night alone was uneventful. Jake ordered pizza, played video games, and stayed up late watching horror movies. It wasn't until he got up to use the bathroom that he noticed something strange. As he passed the mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection, but it was wrong. His reflection was still sitting on the couch, controller in hand, staring at the TV. Jake froze, his heart pounding. He turned to look at the couch, but it was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection was gone. The mirror showed only an empty hallway, bathed in the faint glow of the TV. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, the mirror began to change. At first, it was subtle. His reflection would blink when he didn't or smile when he frowned. But soon, the reflection started to move on its own, mimicking his actions with a slight delay, as if it were learning from him. One night, he woke up to find the reflection standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with hollow eyes. Jake tried to cover the mirror with a sheet, but it didn't help. The reflection was still there, watching him, waiting. He tried to smash the mirror, but the glass wouldn't break. It was like hitting a brick wall. Desperate, he called his parents, but they didn't answer. He was alone. The final night was the worst. The reflection stepped out of the mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural. It looked like Jake, but its eyes were empty, its smile too wide. It began to replace him piece by piece in the real world. It answered his parents' calls with a perfect imitation of his voice. It went to school, hung out with his friends, lived his life, while Jake was pulled into the mirror's cold, dark void. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his reflection, now fully in control of his life, waving goodbye from the other side of the glass. Story: The clock that counts down. The clock was old, its face yellowed with age, its hands frozen in place. It had been in the attic for as long as Mr. Grayson could remember, buried under piles of dusty boxes and forgotten furniture. He had never paid much attention to it, until the day he decided to clean out the attic. The clock was heavier than it looked, its wooden casing carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them too long. Mr. Grayson carried it downstairs and placed it on the mantel in the living room. It looked out of place among the modern furniture, but he didn't care. It was a conversation piece, something to break the monotony of his lonely life. That night, he wound up the clock. The ticking was loud, almost deafening in the silence of the house. But it wasn't the sound that bothered him, it was the way the hands moved. Instead of counting the hours, they were counting down. The numbers on the face were strange, too, symbols he didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. As the days passed, the ticking grew louder, more insistent. Mr. Grayson began to notice changes in the house. Furniture moved when he wasn't looking. Doors creaked open on their own. Faint footsteps echoed in the empty halls. He tried to ignore it, but the ticking was always there, a constant reminder that something was wrong. The final night was the worst. The ticking was deafening, the hands of the clock spinning faster and faster. Mr. Grayson tried to smash the clock, but it wouldn't break. It was like hitting a brick wall. Desperate, he grabbed a hammer and swung with all his might. The clock shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then the front door creaked open. Mr. Grayson turned, his heart pounding. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the shadowy figure stepping inside, its eyes glowing with a faint, sickly light. Each of these stories taps into the fear of isolation and the unknown, blending real-life elements with supernatural horror in true Stephen King fashion. Let me know if you'd like me to expand on any of them further.